sir. State called Dr. Brett Turner.
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Will you state your name, please?
Brett Wayne Turner.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a licensed psychologist,
And do you have a specialty?
neuropsychology.
And what is that for the record?
Well, it's basically the evaluation of the behavior and the brain, how the brain functions, and the resulting behavior that you get from the brain function.
And can you tell the jurors the education that you have?
Sure. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology from the University of West Florida. I also completed a master's degree from the University of West Florida in psychology. Completed a doctorate degree in clinical psychology and neuropsychology from the Florida Institute of Technology. Also completed a one-year internship as part of that training at Harvard Medical School and the West Roxbury VA Medical Center in Boston.
Okay, and is that specialized training at Harvard and West Roxbury? What were you doing there?
The majority of it was working with patients that had a variety of different brain problems, dementia cases, brain injuries, stroke, things of that nature. I'm also consulted to the spinal cord injury unit there and also the neurology unit at the hospital.
Okay. And are you licensed?
Yes, I am.
What type of licenses do you own?
Psychology. That's how psychologists are licensed in Florida. It's just psychology.
Okay. And what about any memberships or affiliations that you may have?
Yeah, the two main ones are American Psychological Association and the National Academy of Neuropsychology.
And what about any honors or achievements?
Yes, I've been the past president of the Northwest Florida chapter of the Florida Psychological Association, and so that would be the main thing that I can think of. Sure.
Are you published?
I have, yes.
Okay, and I'm not going to go through all your publications, but what does that mean?
Well, basically that I've participated in research with colleagues and had several articles published in a variety of different areas throughout my career. Not much recently. More recent years I've been mostly focused on my clinical practice.
Okay. So. And have you taught at any colleges?
Yes, I was an adjunct instructor at the University of West Florida in psychology for about 10 years.
Okay. And what did you teach?
Learning and memory was one of the primary courses that I taught. I also taught other general courses in psychology there as well, undergraduate.
Okay. Do you have a practice here locally in Pensacola?
I do.
And how long have you practiced there?
Well, I've been practicing in psychology and neuropsychology since 1999, but I also practiced before I went to complete my doctorate, starting in 1992. I was practicing here at Cordova Counseling Center as a mental health counselor at that time.
And what areas do you practice at Cordova Counseling? What do you do?
Well, most of my practice currently is in the area of neuropsychology. Okay. And so most of that is, again, working with brain injured patients and evaluating dementia patients and stroke and things of that nature, traumatic brain injury.
And do you get referrals from neurologists?
That's primarily where I get the referrals from.
Okay, and how does that work?
Well, usually a patient will see a neurologist if they're having some kind of problem, or their family will bring them in. And for that, and if the neurologist is not able to determine what the diagnosis is, and hence the treatment that would follow, then they might refer that patient to me to do cognitive testing, so we can help them figure out what the actual diagnosis is, and then offer some treatment recommendations.
Okay. So once you get a patient referral from a neurologist or a medical doctor, what do you do?
Well, I meet with the patient, and usually we always request that a family member accompanies them because we like to talk to the family too, because they have a different perspective on things a lot of times about the patient's behavior. But I'll interview the patient and their family, maybe an hour and a half or so, sit with them, and then if it's necessary, which most of the time it is necessary, then I get them set up with appointments for neuropsychological testing.
Okay. Do you do IQ testing as well at times?
That's usually part of the assessment, yes.
Now, does the neurologist typically do testing before you would see the patient?
They do their own neurological exam, and that usually consists of their own clinical interview. They'll go through and test cranial nerves and reflexes and things of that nature. I think Dr. Colino mentioned several of the things that he does, and that's pretty typical. They'll do a mental status examination, those kinds of things. So.
And then do you rely on their interpretations in your evaluation?
Yes, it's usually important because they're seeing some symptoms, and so I want to know what those symptoms are, and then do my own assessment of those symptoms.
Okay.
So.
And how helpful are MRIs in looking at, I guess, neurodegenerative issues?
Yeah, well, of the referrals that I get, usually they're not very helpful, and the reason is because most of the referrals that I get are in the early stages of the disease process, and so early on, unless you have a stroke or a significant brain injury, then a lot of times the MRIs don't really show a whole lot in those cases.
What type of neurological diseases don't typically show up in an MRI?
Well, the most common is Alzheimer's. I mean, that's the most common type of dementia, but all of the neurodegenerative disorders that we've talked about, and Dr. Colino mentioned those, in the very early stages, you see very little on MRIs usually.
Okay. And would that include frontotemporal dementia?
That's right, yes.
And can we just call that FTD?
Sure.
Okay. Now, as part of your practice, do you evaluate defendants in the criminal justice system?
I do.
And is that for a variety of reasons?
Yes.
And does that sometimes refer to competency in patient or in defendants?
Yes, that's right.
Insanity?
Insanity, right.
Sentencing hearings?
Yes, sentencing hearings.
Okay. And do you also do these evaluations for a variety of different parties?
I do.
Okay. And who are those parties?
Well, actually, the court refers a lot of the evaluations, competency evaluations, usually, but I also receive requests for evaluations from the defense and as well as the state.
Okay. And who do you primarily do work for, state or defense?
Most of my work has been for the defense, actually.
And does your experience include cases where the state is seeking the death penalty?
Yes.
Have you testified previously as an expert in your field?
Yes, multiple times.
How many times? I know you don't keep a check mark, but approximately how many times over the years?
Just a wide estimate would be 150 times, maybe.
Now, were you hired by the state attorney's office in Mr. Hartung's case?
I was.
And when were you retained by me?
I believe my first contact with you or your office was actually in 2015. And then in 2017, I think I received some case information, things of that nature.
Okay. And have you reviewed documents related to State of Florida versus Donald Hartung?
I have.
Tell the jurors what documentation you have reviewed.
Sure. Well, I reviewed the arrest and offense reports, crime scene photos. I read statements given by Marlon Purifoy. I've read the deposition that Dr. Zeman gave and the deposition of Dr. Colino, that's right. I've also reviewed the different documents that the jury saw yesterday with the neuroquant, MRI analysis of Mr. Hartung's brain. There were additional records, a PET scan by Dr. Wu. There was a structured interview form for seizures that was completed by Dr. Colino, and a mental status, mini mental state exam form that Dr. Colino also completed. Also viewed a video of a jail visitation that a defendant had with a couple of volunteers.
Do you have the date on that?
The date is August. I don't remember the day. I don't have that.
What year?
Of 2019.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you also review raw data from the testing of Dr. Zeman?
I did.
Okay. Did you interview Mr. Hartung's son, Donald Hartung Jr.?
I did.
And when was that?
I'll have to look at my notes.
Sure.
On January 27th of this year.
Now, have you also had an opportunity to actually meet with Donald Hartung Sr.?
I have.
And when was that?
That was actually on the 31st, January 31st of this year.
Okay. And why just so recently?
Well, it's my understanding that that's the rules in the court order, is that that I was only allowed to do that within 48 hours after a conviction.
Okay. And how long did you meet with Mr. Hartung on January 31st, 2020?
My actual face-to-face time with him was just shy of 2.5 hours.
And what did you do in that 2.5 hours?
I did a clinical interview and a mental status exam. So basically just getting background information, about his family and upbringing and about his life, and asking or inquiring about any symptoms that he may have had of mental health disorders or, any cognitive issues, things of that nature. And also doing a behavioral assessment and just kind of watching interactions with him and just kind of seeing if there's anything that stands out that might be an indication of some kind of problem or a symptom of some type.
Okay. And was any testing of Mr. Hartung conducted?
Yes.
By who?
My assistant.
Okay. And is that common or uncommon for your assistant to conduct the testing?
Very common.
Okay. And how was that actually done?
Well, actually, when I was finishing up with Mr. Hartung, my assistant came to the jail, and we were there together for just a few minutes, and then she began doing testing. And one of the things that Mr. Hartung was actually in a cage when I saw him. That's what they require in his case. And then I had to ask jail administration if they would allow him to be released from that cage so he could participate in the testing, which they did. Okay. And so they were able to do that. And
is the testing that your assistant does at your request? In other words, you tell her what to test for?
That's right.
Okay. And is there any interpretation of this testing done on her part?
No.
Okay. Is it basically just kind of mechanics or data gathering?
It's data gathering, and the manuals for all of these tests that we use are very specific, and you just follow the directions in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how long has your assistant been conducting these type of tests?
For me, she's worked for me since 2014.
And did she do some before that with a partner of yours?
Yes, Dr. Bingham, who's my partner at my office, she worked for him for the year, I think 2013, doing testing also.
Okay. So what tests did you have conducted on Mr. Hartung?
Sure. Okay. I did not conduct IQ testing because Dr. Zeman had conducted that previously, and didn't want to repeat the same tests. IQ scores tend to be very susceptible to practice effects that we call them, and so you don't want to give an IQ test after a person just took one just a few months earlier.
Okay.
I didn't have the specific date, but I knew it was recent enough that I didn't want to repeat that.
What was the result, or what is Mr. Hartung's IQ level?
It's 106, which is in the average range.
Did you see any areas that he performed better than others?
On the IQ testing?
Yes.
His verbal language abilities were in the high average range. 112 was that score. And working memory was 117. That's also in the high average range. And so those were noticeably better than the other scores that were in the average range.
Okay. Okay, so if you didn't do IQ testing, what did you do?
Sure. So the Wechsler memory scale, that's a test of verbal and visual memory. Also the California Verbal Learning Test, which is another verbal memory test. The Ray Complex Figure Test, which is a visual memory test. And then you've heard a lot about this up to this point, the DCAF's Dallas-Kaplan Executive Function System. And it's a battery of 9 different subtests that look at frontal lobe function. So.
And is that frontal lobe function, is that also what's called executive functioning?
That's correct.
Okay. And did you do any like personality type tests?
Oh yes, also did personality testing, and that was the Milan clinical multi-axial inventory. Tongue twister there.
How long did it take your assistant to just do the testing on Mr. Hartung?
About 2.5 hours. She completed everything.
And then how long did it take her, I guess, did she input information to give to you, or?
Yeah, I mean, most of these tests have computer scoring programs, and so she, when she has to test in the jail, she brings the responses back, and she plugs all the numbers into the computer program, and it gives us all the scores.
Okay, so. And do you know about how long that takes?
Approximately an hour, maybe.
Okay, so you spent about 2.5 hours with Mr. Hartung, and your assistant spent about 3.5 testing and
Inputting. Yeah, data input, that's right.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors what your hourly fee is?
Sure. Again, it's set by the state. It is $240 an hour, except for when I'm actually conducting an evaluation in person with the defendant, and at that point, that's $175 an hour, I believe.
Okay. And approximately how many hours do you have on this case since 2015?
I think at this point I have around 40 hours or so. Now,
at the time you went and met with Mr. Hartung, were you aware of the testing that Dr. Zeman had already done?
Yes.
And did you do the same tests?
I tried to avoid that where possible, but I did repeat a few of the same subtests. And actually, they were the DCAFs subtests. He selected a few of the subtests on the DCAFs, and I gave the entire DCAFs battery of 9 subtests.
Okay, and why do you try to avoid retesting the areas that Dr. Zeman did?
Well, most of the time, again, IQ testing is the most susceptible to practice effects. But where possible, I want to try to avoid any possibility of practice effects or things like that that might influence the test results. But with executive function, there's less of an issue with that, and so I really wasn't worried about the practice effects on that particular battery of tests.
Okay, and you said that Dr. Zeman gave some subsets of this DCAF testing?
Yes, that's right, yes.
But you did the whole battery of them?
Right.
All right, now the areas that were repeated, did you have similar results with Mr. Hartung that Dr. Zeman did?
I had similar results, but there were a couple of tests that were actually worse in my case.
Okay, can you explain those?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Okay, one of the tests is called the sorting test, and basically it's a test of, we call it visual conceptualization or abstraction, and it's basically just looking at different figures and shapes and trying to come up with associations between them. So it's just an abstract kind of reasoning or problem-solving test. And he scored in the average or normal range in all of the scores on that with Dr. Zeman. In my case, he scored in the normal range on the first subtest, and then the 3 subsequent subtests were in the mildly impaired range.
Okay. And what about a color word test?
Yes. We weren't able to give the color word test, and Mr. Hartung informed my assistant that he was colorblind or had some color blindness.
Okay.
So, and that certainly would affect the test. So.
And Dr. Zeman already testified that he didn't do any malingering testing with
Right.
Mr. Hartung, but you did.
I did.
Okay. And do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Hartung was malingering?
No, none whatsoever.
What about putting forth a full effort?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that's hard to really say for sure. I do know that the unfortunate part of it is that I got to see him within just a couple of days of the conviction, and so I know that that's not good, you know.
Right.
I'm sure that had some effect on him, and so I think that he initially didn't want to participate in the testing, which, you know, I understand, but one of his attorneys was actually there when I met with him initially, and was able to explain why it was necessary, and then he participated.
Okay. So what did your executive functioning frontal lobe testing show on Mr. Hartung?
Well, there is some evidence of mild frontal lobe dysfunction. When you look at the subtests of the DCAFs, the 9 subtests, basically you can also calculate an overall score to just kind of get a snapshot of generally, you know, do the tests really tell us there's frontal lobe dysfunction here? And rather than separating out every single subtest, and which is a good thing to do, you need to do that. And that score was actually 84. 85 and above is normal. So you can see 84 is right at the edge, but it is in the impaired range. It's in the mildly impaired range.
So you would agree with Dr. Colino, Dr. Zeman, that Mr. Hartung has some mild cognitive impairment?
Yes.
And would you say that his impairment is clear cut?
No.
Okay, and why not?
Well, we've heard a lot about FTD, and that certainly is a significant neurologic disorder or problem or disease. The thing that's inconsistent in this case is that there are some scores that are in the mildly impaired range on mine and Dr. Zeman's testing, for sure. Dr. Colino's brain scans put him in the severe range, apparently, of atrophy. But behaviorally speaking, I see very little evidence of significant brain impairment. And so that would be the inconsistency that I'm seeing with this whole case.
Now, the mild impairments that you saw in Mr. Hartung, can there be other neurological diseases?
Diseases, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not necessarily unique to FTD.
Right.
Now, you said that you reviewed a video visitation of Mr. Hartung from August of 2019.
Correct.
What can you tell the jurors about that as it relates to Mr. Hartung's memory, cognition, things of that nature?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure of the organization. I think it was a Catholic social service organization or something to that effect. And it was two women who had, I think one of them had even maybe met with him previously because she introduced herself again to him. But the discussion was basically about how he was doing in jail, of course, and then talking about the different religious readings and studies that he had been doing lately. And there were some, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but there were some fairly complicated books that he had been studying, and he was able to talk about those books and the dates and details from those books that were it was pretty impressive, to be honest with you. And so he had studied those books and knew them very well.
Do you have any reason to believe, based on your experience, that Mr. Hartung converting to Catholicism supports FTD?
I really think that's a stretch. I asked Mr. Hartung about his upbringing with religion, that kind of thing, and he said that they weren't frequent church goers when he was growing up, but he went to Vacation Bible School and maybe attended church a few times. And I don't know exactly what denomination it was. I was under the impression it was a Protestant, church of some kind. He also told me that he had been interested in Wiccan for many years, and only, I guess, within the last 4 or 5 years now or longer, began to study it, but he always had somewhat of an interest in it. So I know he had gone back and forth a little bit. He also told me that there were some interesting similarities between Catholicism and Wiccan. And I know nothing about Wiccan, so but it sounded interesting anyway, what he had to say. There were some pretty interesting arguments that he made.
Okay.
So
Dr. Colino testified yesterday that Mr. Hartung is intelligent. In your meeting with him, in your conversations with him, how did he come across to you? Would you agree or disagree?
I agree. He's intelligent. He was very articulate. He actually was a good conversationalist. He was a pleasure to speak with. He was very polite and appropriate. There was nothing inappropriate at all. Very cooperative. So.
Now, when you spoke with Mr. Hartung, did he relate some sexual abuse he experienced as a child?
Yes.
Okay. And did he relate to you that maybe his mom had been a little neglectful of him as a child?
Yes, I think, excuse me, she was working at Kimstrand for a number of years, and because of the drive, with them living in Bruton, she was gone long hours, which left him in the care of his grandfather, and it sounded as if there was not a lot of really good supervision going on there, which left him vulnerable basically to being abused physically and sexually.
And did Mr. Hartung relate to you that his father had abandoned him as a child?
Yes.
Excuse me. Did he relate to you that there was some sort of poverty level when he was a child as well?
Yes.
And did he relate to you an incident where he witnessed his mother shooting an intruder?
Yes, he did.
So would you agree that Mr. Hartung has had some negative or maybe even traumatic aspects of his childhood?
Yes, I would agree.
Now, in the testing that you did on Mr. Hartung, did you see any symptoms or signs of PTSD?
No, I didn't.
And would you have maybe expected that?
Yeah, based on the history that he gave, I really did expect to see some of that, and the thing that came up was depression. And I think the depression had been present for years. It wasn't just a recent thing based on the current circumstances. So.
And what is PTSD, just for the record?
Sure, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay. Now, we've been talking about FTD for some time, and are you familiar with FTD?
I am.
And are you familiar with the behavioral variant?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And how often have you seen FTD in your career?
Well, and this is just a wide estimate, but I've been conducting neuropsychological evaluations for 20 years, and I'm sure that I see, as much as maybe 15 cases, maybe 20 cases a year of it.
Okay. And do you treat, monitor patients with FTD?
Yes.
How does this FTD behavioral variant typically present itself?
Usually you're going to see behavior problems. That's why the name, behavioral variant. And it usually starts as inappropriate social behaviors. You can see some aggression and some outbursts of anger and things of that nature. But the most common thing would be, having that family member speaking out of turn and saying things that are inappropriate to people, embarrassing situations, or maybe even acting out in public a little bit. Like this is just a common example. Forgive my rudeness on this, but having a family member that urinates publicly in front of people, or things of that nature. So those are real common in that.
Okay, and is it a pattern, or is it just a one-time thing? Or
it's a pattern of behaviors. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you were talking about the Wiccan religion a little bit ago. In your opinion, does Mr. Hartung's interest in Wicca a few years back corroborate onset of FTD?
No, I just don't see the connection, not just because he was interested in that for years earlier even.
Now, these abnormal patterns or outbursts or behaviors, do those typically continue with FTD?
Yes.
So it's not really like a kind of one and done type situation?
Absolutely not, no.
Okay. And to your knowledge, has Mr. Hartung had any behavioral outbursts in the past 4 years?
In the jail, no. I'm not aware of any behavior problems that he's had.
Okay, and did you review his jail records?
I did.
Now, Dr. Colino said there's really no way to say definitively that Mr. Hartung has FTD unless he passes away and they do an autopsy.
That's correct.
Do you agree with that?
I do.
Okay.
Yes.
And is there any way to say for certain that Mr. Hartung had FTD back in July 2015?
No.
Is there any way to say that the FTD had a role in the murder of his family?
I think it's hard to say that, in my opinion.
Based on your review of everything in this case, do you have an opinion as to whether Donald Hartung's ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of law was substantially impaired on July 28th, 2015?
Well, and when I hear substantially, that's the key for me. I do not agree with that. That would not be my opinion.
Okay. And do the facts of this case suggest otherwise? The facts of the murder itself?
To me, they do, yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether Donald Hartung was under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance at the time of this incident, July 28, 2015?
Again, the key for me is the word extreme. That implies severe in my clinical opinion. And I don't see anything that tells me that there was extreme or severe duress or anything in that nature.
Or mental or emotional disturbance?
That's right.
Okay. And again, do the facts of the case suggest otherwise?
In my opinion, yes.
Based on your professional experience, what kind of symptoms or behavior would you expect to see in someone with severe brain atrophy?
Well, with severe atrophy, you would expect to see a pattern of dysfunctional behavior, and I think that what Dr. Zeman said earlier is true. Also, is that in a severe or late stages of a disease, like a neurological disease, then you're going to see a person that is probably in a nursing home or needing attendant care 24/7 to make sure that they're safe and not harming themselves or somebody else, or can take get the right kind of day-to-day care they need.
Now, people who are diagnosed with FTD, are they, in your experience, typically prescribed medication?
Well, in my clinical practice, they usually do get medication, yes, once that's given, once the diagnosis is given. Yeah, the medications that are used, and I think Dr. Colino may have mentioned this yesterday, but antipsychotic medication, or neuroleptics as he called them, those are very frequently used because what they do is they tend to bring the dysfunctional or aversive behavior, they bring that down and just get it under control better, and so that way loved ones and people that are caring for them have less difficulty, caring for them. Sometimes they're prescribed antidepressants, depending. I mean, if there's a significant problem with depression, you might see that.
Okay. And was Donald Hartung prescribed any medication when you saw him?
No.
Does he have any history of those medications in the past 6 months since Dr. Colino diagnosed him with FTD?
None that I'm aware of.
In your experience, these 15 to 20 people that you see per year in your number of years, I can't do math, how many of those people with FTD have murdered 3 members of their family?
Well, none that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Turner. Those are all my questions.
Good morning, Dr. Turner.
Good morning.
I'm going to see if I can get through this without croaking too much, but if I become hard to understand, please let me know.
Sure.
You testified a few minutes ago that at this point you had roughly 40 hours in the case.
That's correct.
And how much of that have you billed in the last day and a half sitting here in the courtroom?
Well, I will bill for my time for yesterday and as well as today.
So as of Monday, you had about 25 hours in, is that correct?
Something like that, 25 to, yeah, roughly under 30.
So much of the time, much of the difference between that 25 and 40 has to do with you sitting in here in the courtroom, observing and waiting to be called as a witness?
That's correct.
And in your training for psychology and neuropsychology, you have not done the 2-year fellowship in neuropsychology?
That's correct.
And because of that, you are not eligible to sit for the boards in neuropsychology?
Actually, that's not correct. I did some checking after my deposition the other day, and when I graduated, those standards were actually not in place. And so I've been doing this long enough that I actually can sit for the boards. I just have to prove that the training that I had was equivalent to a 1-year postdoc, because that's all that was required back then. So there were very few postdocs back then, and so that was the reasoning for that.
So that has changed since we spoke on Monday?
That's correct, yes.
You've met with Mr. Hartung one time?
Yes, that's right.
And when you met with Mr. Hartung, he told you about a number of incidents that were traumatic to him that had occurred when he was a child, correct?
Yes, he did, yes.
He told you about numerous incidents of sexual molestation,
He did.
and that was at the hands of several different people?
That's right. I think Uncle Pete, if I remember correctly, and there was also a neighbor, and then also the son of a individual that his mother saw or they lived with briefly. There were multiple incidents, yes.
So you would agree that there were multiple incidents over multiple years?
Yes.
And he also told you about the incident where his mother shot an intruder?
Yes, he did. I believe he was 8 years old when that happened.
And he also told you that after that occurred, his mother had a nervous breakdown?
Yes.
And he told you that his father abandoned him as a child?
Yes. I believe at 3 weeks, if I remember correctly.
So you would agree that negative environments will shape a person's personality?
Oh, they can.
And you would agree that Mr. Hartung did have some traumatic experiences and negative environments in his childhood?
Yes, according to him.
And you verified some of that through his son, Donald, correct?
That's right, yes.
But you did not go to any of his other family members to verify, correct?
No, I did not.
Would you agree that research on adverse childhood experiences is correlated to poor outcomes in life?
I know that it can be, yes.
And it's correlated to poorer medical outcomes?
Yes.
And poorer mental health
Yes.
existences? Okay. It can also include shorter lifespans?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And other effect can be a lack of affect,
Yes, it can
correct?
be.
Can you explain what lack of affect is?
Sure. Well, affect is basically your outward showing of emotion. And so A lack of affect would basically be someone that is not showing emotion or not showing that they're attached emotionally or engaged emotionally is the right word.
And another effect of adverse childhood experience can be insecure attachments
Yes,
and the inability to maintain relationships.
that's right.
And many of these symptoms can begin to show at a very young age.
They can, sure.
And depression might also be another one of those results.
Yes.
Would you agree that symptoms of depression and lack of affect and apathy can also be symptoms of dementia?
They can be.
And you agree with Dr. Zeman's conclusion that pertaining to Mr. Hartung, there is something neurologic going on?
Yes, I do.
And would you agree that when you were interpreting your testing results, you did not consider the error profile in your calculations?
Yes, actually, those scores are optional, and you really only use the error scores if that subtest is in the impaired range. And so, there were multiple subtests that were not in the abnormal or impaired range. I didn't find the error scores to be that useful. So.
But you didn't actually look at the error scores?
No, I did not compute them, in other words, no.
So with an error score and you not calculating those into your test results, I could stand up here and I could say, I type 150 words a minute, but wait, if you take my error score out of that, I really type 25 words a minute, correct? So the
You
error
could say that,
score,
sure, yeah.
the error score, yeah, I don't know what I really type, but that's my analogy.
Jensen, any further?
No, Your Honor, not from the state.
Stay rest this time.
State rest.
All right, members of the jury, we're going to take a lunch break a little early because I don't want to try to break up closing argument. And we're going to try to get your lunches before noon, but we're going to take a longer lunch break until 1 o'clock. If you get your lunches quicker, then maybe we'll start back a little earlier than 1. But it will come from Seville. We want to make sure when they got here, they're going to be warm. So I didn't want y'all to be in the middle of closing argument when your lunches arrive and they sit there for a half hour waiting. So we'll take our lunch break now and we'll be back at 1 or sooner. Okay? All right. All right. So we have the final instructions and the verdict form. Has the defense had time to review that? No objection to the totality. State have any questions about them?
No, Judge, since I prepared them, I did add that I am requesting that special instruction. I provided case law.
Which one was that?
It's under number 1, Judge, where it says previously convicted of another capital felony includes capital felony convictions resulting from crimes committed on separate victims during a single criminal episode.
I'm asking for that instruction just because I think the way it's worded is confusing. Just the fact that the defendant was previously convicted of another capital felony without explanation.
So are you saying this is how you want it to read?
Yes, I added that part that has the asterisks, just to make sure that it was okay with the court and with the defense.
That's fine, but in that exact form?
Yes.
Okay. And the defense didn't express an objection?
No objection.
All right, so we'll break. If they're through by 12:30, y'all want to know? Steve, or you just want to count on 1?
Let's just count on 1.
Okay, that's fine.
I might need to get my Star Wars PowerPoint together.
You're asking me, you're going to wear your hair up.
Some sentences.
All right, so we'll be in recess.
Oh, wait, Judge, we still need to go through the other instructions, though. I think we need to add maybe the mitigators, perhaps.
Sorry. Let's go through page by page. One, there's no objection.
No objection. Oh, the one issue is where the asterisks are on number 1, if those could be taken out.
Oh, sure. I just put it in there to show everyone where I had added it.
Okay.
I'll take that out.
And 2 is okay?
No objection.
So, Ms. Jensen, why don't you go straight to the things you think are at issue?
Okay, so on page 2, obviously we'll tailor the victim impact paragraph, because it just has the parentheses.
Okay.
So we'll fix that. On page 3, I'm not we need to know what the defense wants.
Would you want to think about that and get with Ms. Jensen within the next half hour?
If I could just look back through my notes, please,
Okay. You mean right now? Or,
in the next half hour.
okay. And any other areas? Well, we're going to take out on page 8, seems to me 6, 7, 9, and 10. At least.
On page 5,
Yeah, page 5.
I think number 6 would apply just because money was elicited on just about every witness.
Okay.
That's fine.
I don't think 7,
9 or 10.
7, 9, or 10, certainly not.
No, does 8 apply? I don't
Just grab that. Do you want to leave that in?
I'll renumber to 7.
All right, anything else?
The defendant's testimony on page 6.
Correct, so you take out the italic language.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Oh, and take out number 5 without juror questions.
Yes, sir.
And then on the exhibits, just use A.
Okay.
All right? And I'm sure y'all will work out whatever the defense wants on the mitigation, but if there's an issue that needs to be addressed before 1, just let me know.
Ms. Wilson, can you stop by the office and figure it out?
I can tell you just a couple minutes.
And Mr. Hartung, just, I asked you about 45 minutes ago or so, or an hour. And now that the penalty evidence has concluded, is there any other input on today's proceedings you want to do?
No, sir.
All right, we'll be adjourned till 1 o'clock.